What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. So, as spring practice is approaching, most teams want to keep as much continuity and focus as possible heading into training camps and the first practices of next year's team. However, that hasn't really been able to be the case for Georgia, who, coming off of a historic national championship run, is now facing extremely high coaching turnover as they have lost their defensive coordinator and outside linebacker coach in Dan Lanning, their defensive back coach in Jamil Adai, their wide receiver coach in Cortez Hankton, and their offensive line coach in Matt Luke. On top of that, they've also suffered 2 decommitments recently from their 2023 recruiting class, which has led some people to say that Georgia is in trouble going forward. So, in this video, I wanted to talk about the coaching attrition and give my opinion on if Georgia is really in any kind of trouble heading forward into the future. So let's begin by just hitting on all of the coaching moves and their implications individually. The Dan Lanning move was basically expected at this point, after how much of a hot name he had really become in the coaching world and how well his defenses had performed at Georgia over the years. He, was sort of expected to move on at some point. He was one of the very best coordinators in America, as well as being an elite recruiter, so losing him obviously hurts. There's no way around that. But if there ever was a school that was best positioned to lose an elite defensive coordinator, it's Georgia. With Kirby Smart being heavily involved in the defense at all times, and now you have other guys on the staff like Will Muschamp and Coach Schumann acting as the co-defensive coordinators next year going forward, the defense is in more than competent hands. I mean, it should honestly be just fine. Yes, losing Lanning hurts, but there's so much other qualified coaching on that staff. They are going to be just fine. Not to mention the insane amount of talent that Georgia has and will always have under Kirby on the defensive side of the ball. Losing Lanning, like I said, is unfortunate, but honestly, it shouldn't have too big of a long-term impact on the field because the Georgia program, particularly on defense, is just built like a machine at this point. The replacement outside linebackers coach that Georgia hired is from TCU, whose name I really won't even try to pronounce because I will just end up butchering it. But he has a good reputation, and players seem to love him. He's also a strong recruiter with good ties to the state of Texas, and I'm sure if he passed the interview process with that defensive staff in Athens, then he'll be just fine in his role. Moving on to the Jamil Adai move, where he left the program to go to Miami under new head coach Mario Cristobal. This move was also somewhat expected, but not to the same extent as Lanning. Lanning was almost a foregone conclusion that he'd be leaving to go somewhere soon. Adai, there were some rumors about it, but nothing as concrete as with the Lanning situation. But Adai has proven in his time at Georgia to be an elite defensive back recruiter, especially if you look at his most recent and really only full defensive back class that he signed at Georgia. It's absolutely full of 4 and 5 stars. However, with Kirby and Muschamp being on the staff, it's hard to say how much of that credit goes to Adai and how much of that credit should go to them as well. I mean, I don't want to take anything away from Adai, obviously, but Georgia's defense sort of speaks for itself. It sort of recruits itself. Kirby's a defensive back coach at heart. So is Will Muschamp, and they're both involved in coaching the defensive back. So credit to Adai for sure, but still, not all of that was him most likely. And regardless, though, Adai was clearly doing something right by managing to land these guys, and he coached up a pretty strong secondary on the field this year. To me, though, the biggest story with this coaching spot isn't necessarily that Adai left, it's just the sheer amount of attrition at the position, both on the field with the players and in the coaching roles. Georgia has rolled through a new defensive back coach basically every year since Kirby has gotten there. They've had guys like Adai, they've had Charlton Warren, they had Mel Tucker at one point. The defensive back spot has seen a lot of turnover. Kelee Ringo, for example, who's a redshirt sophomore and is a likely starting and potentially star-level corner this year, has had 3 different position coaches in just 3 years at Georgia. And that's something that even a guy like Kirby likely can't maintain, and even if he can, he definitely doesn't want to. Luckily, though, Kirby and Muschamp, like I said, both work extensively with the DBs already, and they likely will in the future as well, which honestly could have something to do with all of the coaching turnover there. I can't imagine it's easy to be a defensive back coach for a guy like Kirby Smart, especially with how involved and hands-on he is with your position. I'm sure it leads to some things where you don't feel like you have autonomy over your own position and things like that. not to mention all of the pressure that he's going to put on you as a defensive backs coach. However, the new hire, Fran Brown, is out of Rutgers. He has a very good reputation in the coaching world. He's considered to be a very good recruiter, particularly in the Northeast, and recruiting is always an important role for any new coach at Georgia. I don't expect him to make too big of an impact, as like I said, Kirby basically controls that position group, so it's really whoever the actual position coach is for the DBs. They're more of an assistant position coach, if we're being honest about things, because they're not going to get full autonomy over their position. Kirby is going to control a large portion of that anyway. All he needs to do is work with the DBs, do a good job there, build good relationships with the players, and recruit very well, and it seems like Fran Brown is going to be good enough at doing that. I'm not too worried about him, particularly in the back end as a coach. I don't think it's too crucial of a role for Georgia based on who they currently have on their staff anyway. Regardless, though, Georgia needs more consistency at the defensive back spot, both on the staff and on the roster, as the turnover in the back end is just unsustainable long term. That brings us to the Cortez Hankton move, which was somewhat unexpected considering he left for the same job at another school, but then when you see the pay raise he got, it makes a lot of sense that he would leave. Hankton is a coach with somewhat mixed reviews, though mostly positive from his time at Georgia. He was beloved by the players, he has an outstanding reputation in the coaching world, and nobody wanted to see him go by any means. But at the same time, wide receiver production under him has been somewhat lackluster at times. Now, I blame much more of that on the offense as a whole and on quarterback play style, etc., than I do just on Hankton, okay? I mean, Hankton was an up-and-down recruiter for Georgia at times. He would land big-name wide receivers, but never as consistently as the other position groups do at Georgia, which can also be attributed to the offense as a whole and the style of play they run, not just on Hankton individually. And, you know, the loss would be a lot more concerning to me if Georgia hadn't hired Brian McClendon as his replacement. McClendon is a guy with strong Georgia ties. He has a tremendous amount of love and respect from his peers and his players, and McClendon had even taken the co-offensive coordinator role at Miami, but left it to be just the wide receivers coach at Georgia, mainly due to his super strong Athens ties. And he is a very, very good coach. I mean, there is no concern about him, for me at least. Georgia is incredibly happy to have him, and they should be. He will need to recruit some more big-name talent to Georgia at the wide receiver position, develop a little bit more on-field production in conjunction with the offense as a whole, but I think McClendon as a hire is about as good as it gets for a position coach hire at this point, so I'm really not concerned about him as a position coach going forward. That move, to me, is at worst lateral, at best an upgrade for Georgia. And that brings us to the most recent coaching loss for Georgia, and that is Matt Luke. And Luke is an interesting story because he isn't leaving to go somewhere else or take another job, but rather because he wants to be home with his family more, and who can blame him for that? I mean, these coaches consistently are putting in 100-plus hour work weeks every week, just about all year long, and that is incredibly draining on a person and very draining on a family as well. Kirby Smart even said this in an interview after the national championship, that if things in college football don't change, you're going to lose a lot of good people from the sport that aren't going to want to do it anymore because it's just too demanding. There's no schedule. It's a constant year-round thing. You know, you have NIL, you have the transfer portal. You just keep adding more and more responsibility to these coaches, and so you really can't blame Luke for wanting to step away. He's more than fine financially. He'll have a coaching career in the future if he wants one. He's going to be fine, and you can't get those years with your family back, so I totally don't blame him for that. But Luke did provide a nice veteran presence on the staff as he was a former head coach in the SEC, and those are always valuable staff members to have. However, he did have the unenviable position of replacing Sam Pittman, who is, in my opinion, the best offensive line coach in college football, and now is the head coach at Arkansas. Pittman was beyond loved as a recruiter and a player, or as a recruiter and a coach by his players and by his colleagues on the staff. He was an outstanding recruiter. He landed, 5-star after 5-star. He was a huge name for Georgia, and he did an amazing job for them. And Luke, while, being a good recruiter and his players loved him too, and the on-the-field offensive line play was good, it just was never the same once Pittman left, and neither was their recruiting. I mean, that's not to say it was bad by any means, because it wasn't. And like I said, comparing him to Pittman is really difficult because Pittman is, in my opinion, the best in the business. But it would have been nice to see Georgia land a few more blue-chip offensive linemen under Luke. And the guard play in particular was just not up to standard for Georgia, especially this past season. And there was a lot of question marks about that, a lot of details about, who should play where, especially with guys like Jamari Sawyer and stuff that I don't want to get into in this video. But Luke had an up and down tenure at Georgia. And, I think he really, now that he is, sort of stepping away, you're seeing a lot more people talk about it, because at the time, nobody was really complaining about it because the offensive line play was good enough. It just wasn't great. It wasn't up to what Georgia had gotten used to under Pittman. And honestly, I think it's an area where Georgia could improve going forward in the future. But Luke was still incredibly valuable to the staff with his experience as a head coach and things like that. He was a good recruiter, very valuable coach. You don't want to see him go. Nobody is happy to see him leave. But, it's not a super crushing loss either for Georgia. And the new hire here, Stacy Searles, I think. I don't know how to say his name 100%. I'm not sure. But anyway, he's another guy with strong Georgia ties dating back to the Mark Richt days in Athens. He was serving as the offensive line coach at North Carolina before leaving for Georgia just recently, and his hiring has been met with a mixed reception. On the one hand, fans trust Kirby to make the right decision and the right hire, but there is a lot of concern about if this guy can recruit at the same level that Georgia expects him to. And for that, only time will tell. I personally am very confident in basically whoever Kirby hires, because I understand he knows more about the sport than I do and than any of the fans do, and he certainly knows more about how to pick a coach in an interviewing process better than any of us do. So I'm not going to critique any of his coaching hires, at least until I see how they actually perform on the field. But I do understand the recruiting concerns as well. I don't see this as some slam dunk hire like I see the Brian McClendon hire or anything like that, but it definitely isn't a bad one either. I mean, they picked a guy who's a great culture fit for Georgia. He loves Georgia. He loves Athens. He has a very extensive track record as an offensive line coach, both inside the SEC and outside of it. The biggest question is his recruiting acumen, but that's really hard to judge until you see him in this particular role at this university under this coaching staff at this time. It's really hard to judge if somebody's a good recruiter or not based on being in other situations. Overall, though, I think the hire is a decent one and a safe one, but it is the most worrying for me. It's still not worrying, but if I had to pick one, that would be the one. So now that I've gone over all of the coaching changes, is Georgia really in trouble? Well, frankly, no. No, they're not. But it kind of depends on how you define trouble, I guess. I don't think Georgia's in any danger of losing the top spot in the East, at least not in the immediate future, and I don't see them going away from the national stage. I think they're going to continue to be a playoff contender. I also don't think they're going to stop recruiting at a top 3 level either. Overall, I just don't think Georgia is going to take some kind of massive step back as a program due to these coaching changes. Despite what many rival fan bases may wish, I just don't see that happening. However, if you were to define trouble as a team who won't be the favorite to win the national title next season, then yeah, I guess maybe Georgia's in trouble. I find that definition of trouble kind of ridiculous, but some people do have the belief that if Georgia doesn't win another natty next year, then they're just going to go through another 40-year drought or something like that, which is completely impossible to predict and honestly kind of ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense to me, but I've seen it said fairly frequently, particularly on the internet, which is always a dangerous place to look for honest football opinions, but whatever. But with this amount of coaching turnover, in addition to the absurd amount of roster turnover that is about to head to the NFL, I don't think Georgia should be the favorite to win the national championship next season, but that doesn't mean that they won't, and it doesn't mean that they won't be a playoff team, because I absolutely think that they're a playoff-level team next year. So if you think that that means that they're in trouble, then yes, I would say that they're in trouble. But honestly, the only people who I've seen really feel that way are either rival fan bases who are just kind of trolling to try to make Georgia fans mad, because that's super common for fan bases in the SEC to do to each other, or people who just don't understand how the sport works and they think that this is just like playing on a PlayStation or something, where you just, you win a national title and you just keep on winning them. You just go, plug and play, new coaches, new players, no problem. that doesn't happen. I mean, Nick Saban's been the closest to that, and that doesn't even really happen for them. So, I mean, at this point, Kirby Smart has built Georgia into a machine. I mean, there's no amount of coaching turnover that's going to topple that, save maybe like a really bad offensive coordinator hire. That's the most important hire that he could make. But particularly defensive hires don't mean all that much. I mean, they are still important, don't get me wrong, but they don't mean all that much as an overall program thing, because Kirby's not going to hire people who are bad defensive coaches or bad recruiters, because that's what he does. He knows that incredibly well. And most of the position coaches on offense are the same way. I mean, most of these that we're seeing that just happened are either minor losses or even upgrades in some cases due to the new hires, and none of them are outright bad situations for Georgia either. The only one I'm even remotely concerned about is the offensive line hire, and that one still doesn't really worry me. I just don't know how good of a hire it'll be yet. So overall, no, Georgia is not in any trouble, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon, despite all of the noise currently surrounding the program with the decommits and the coaching turnover. The decommits are likely due to the coaching turnover. There's just a brand new coaching staff, and they don't have relationships with them yet, so they figured they'd open their recruiting back up, even if those guys don't end back up at Georgia. Do you really think that Georgia's not going to have a top 5 recruiting class, or at least a top 3 recruiting class, most likely? To be honest, they never haven't done that under Kirby Smart. He always does that. I'm not that worried about that either. Anyway, that'll do it for this video. Let me know down below in the comments section what you guys think about all of the coaching changes at Georgia, and if they are in any amount of trouble going forward. Also, if you made it this far in the video, go ahead and leave a like because it helps out the channel tremendously, and subscribe for more college football content in the future, as I will continue to upload very regularly. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.